Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm very excited about this guest I have on. He is an ex-Mormon. He is an atheist who is currently combing his beard in anticipation to be
Correct.
interviewed here on Mormon
Yeah.
Book Reviews.
Best ex-Mormon beard 5 years running.
That's what I hear. So congratulations once again. But you're a thoughtful person. You're a very interesting person. You're a person who actually is fascinated by religion and religious thought and religious thinkers. We had a really deep conversation about a week or so ago, and I thought, wow, you'd make a great guest for our program. So again, this is not an anti-Mormon program, folks. This is a program where we talk to all the different voices of the restoration, including those who are no longer part of it. But in one sense, you'll always be part of it, right, Joe?
That's true. I
That's true.
mean, basically, there is something to say for it. We talked a little bit about this before. Christopher Hitchens, of all people, once made the case that, and he took it from somebody else, I'm not sure who, that, when we talk criticism as atheists of Christianity, one of the things that we sometimes get lost in is Christendom. Is this idea of Christendom in the old world was this idea that Christianity is not just Christianity, it's the influence of Western civilization. And while even he would argue, while we can argue all day against the origins of Christianity, the truth of Christianity, etc., we can't really argue against the influence of Christendom because it exists. It is there, and we benefit from it, frankly. And
Yeah.
so, in a way, I feel like Mormonism has been kind of that way even for ex-Mormons, because I think people like Jacob Hansen have pointed this out. It's like they can say they're not Mormon all they want, but a lot of their values and axiomatic systems of people, ex-Mormons like myself, have been informed by Mormonism.
Mm-hmm.
I disagree with Jacob Hansen on just about everything. But on that, I cannot disagree. I think the biggest problem, and I hate to launch right into this because you haven't brought it up yet, but it's been on my mind with Jacob Hansen, is that I see in him a person who's trying to be intellectually sound in his epistemology. But I
Okay.
feel like epistemologically, there are some fundamental flaws in the way he sees, and that are informed by Mormonism. And for those of us who have left the church, largely are the things that have driven us to go, the church gets this wrong. However you feel about Joseph Smith, however you feel about the gold plates in the Book of Mormon, and I know you and I have had conversation about that, uh, you have to admit the church leads people to believe this epistemological fallacy, that everything is driven by axiomatic values. Everything is, if you are a good person, you believe. If you are not a good person, you doubt. And that is fundamentally unsound just to the concept of learning, as any person who is currently atheist or has been atheist I think could agree.
Okay, that's just so. Welcome to the program, Joe Rawlins. With that, how you doing today? I didn't even introduce you.
Good.
That's
Good.
great.
Sorry,
That's
didn't
fine.
mean to come out the gate just like guns firing.
That's fine.
But yeah,
No, I
no,
think
I
that's
am. I'm
interesting. I think you bring a lot to the table, and part of the reason why you and I started conversing with each other is you hopped on one of my live streams and you had mentioned, hey, I'd like to debate Jacob Hansen, and we're going to talk about that because in a little bit. But I want to actually cover some ground before that because I do find Jacob Hansen to be an interesting guy. I've spent a lot of time talking to him on the phone. I'm going to be going on his program. There's a lot of people who don't like the fact that I have Jacob on my program because they feel like I'm platforming him, and I hear this from some people, and it's just like, listen, he's bigger than me. I don't, I don't get how that's me platforming somebody that's bigger than me. I don't get like what that's even about. He's part of the conversation. Actually, I think he's done some of the best stuff we've done was earlier this year when we had Greg Mattson and Jacob Hansen on talking about mixed signals from the church about LGBTQ people and issues. And that one was huge. That was a huge episode and a really important conversation that we had that was covered by John DeLynn and Mormonish and all the other people. Because I think it was, so he does bring something to the table. So I want to defend Jacob Smith and that's Jacob Hansen in that sense. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I actually wanted to, before we get
that was
started.
a curious. I didn't mean to laugh in the middle of your sentence there, but that was a curious Freudian slip when you called him Jacob Smith. Like, Jacob Joseph Smith Hansen.
I love it. Yeah, that's a good point. So as you can see here, we got you have a podcast, and it's called Hellfire Agency, which I'm going to go and I'm going to hit the subscribe button. And I want to encourage everybody. See, this is subconsciously. I want to hit the subscribe
Yes.
button because that will cause other people to hit
Yes.
subscribe. And this is just a little sliver of what you do, which is actually a kind of, well, I actually kind of like your description here, and I'm going to read it. That place where the souls of Exmo and ex-evangelicals go to be with the Prince of Darkness, refreshments on weekends. So it's a little tongue in cheek. I like that you have a place for ex-evangelicals in this world, which I was certainly a part of that community for a very, very long time. And we're going to talk about your thing. I just want to remind you all, folks, of course, you all know Mormon Book Reviews, but we also have the Utah Interfaith Forum. And I want people to also subscribe to that because we're going to start putting out some more stuff. We got some really great conversations that we've taped, and this, I think, is going to be a really important channel as well. So check out Hellfire Agency, subscribe, check out Utah Interfaith Forum. Make sure you're subscribed to both channels because I think there's a lot of interesting conversations going on there. So briefly, we're not here to talk too much about your podcast, but I want you to actually talk a little bit about what it's about. So is it like, am I supposed to, is like a Mormon true crime podcast, or what, how would you describe it?
That's a very good question. There's actually a very good podcast out there called Mormon True Crime, and she can keep
Yeah.
that for that corner. I really see Hellfire Agency as a true crime podcast slash streaming service, if you will, that focuses on the scandals of America's religious right. I think that there's plenty of people out there focused just on why Mormonism isn't true, what the controversies of Mormon history are. And frankly, they're doing a great job. Good for them. I'm happy to have them out there doing it. I don't need to recreate Mormon stories, right? John Dehlin, in my opinion, is doing a phenomenal job at that. There's plenty of that out there. I like the scandals. I like to expose how the history of evangelical Christianity including, I would put in there, the Restorationist movement, including the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and so forth, exposes a lot of the flaws of our understanding of American history. And so, for example, I have a series called Blood Atonement, which is murder among the Mormons. I'm currently, most of my content on there is about Ted Bundy and the controversies that I have a personal connection to that, as do I think most young men who grew up in the church in the 80s and 90s. That doesn't get talked about. Ted Bundy was a Mormon when he was here in Utah, killing girls. I don't want to use, sanctioned words here too heavily, but everything that Ted Bundy did here in Utah, he did while taking discussions with his missionaries, John Homer and Larry Anderson, in the home of people like Seth. Is it Seth Green? Yeah, Sam Green, and so forth. And you look at, for example, people have seen a picture. You may have seen a picture of Ted Bundy washing dishes with a girl at a house party in Salt Lake City. It wasn't a house party; it was a church activity. It was one of many church activities that Ted Bundy attended while he was studying to become a member of the church. And so it's like, and then you look into that, and how did Mormonism play into the stories of these girls, and who they were, and why were people so anxious to believe Bundy? You hear that he was handsome. He wasn't that handsome. You hear that he was charming. Okay, yeah, maybe. Yes, he was, if anything, charismatic. And that charisma, I would put to you, in Mormon culture was very, very important. Inside Mormon culture, to be charismatic and to be spiritual is more or less the same thing. God doesn't just give this gift to anyone. Even the Melchizedek priest is described as the power of God unto the convincing of men, which is, for me, screams a narcissist's understanding of spirituality. If they believe it, you got it. You got the gift. And ironically enough, for Bundy, I put forth the hypothesis that Bundy, who grew up in Washington and was engaged to a Jack Mormon when he decided to enroll in the University of Utah. And I recently found out in a 4-hour interview I did this last weekend. He used to come to Ogden, Utah with her on a regular basis. I didn't realize this before before he moved here. And he would meet with his soon-to-be father-in-law, the man who was a prominent doctor up in Ogden. That during that time he made the decision that inside Mormon culture, inside Utah, he could get away with a lot and get away with it, which in the end proved to be true.
Yeah, and
So
that's actually
think of that.
interesting to me because, I actually we were down here in Florida when Ted Bundy was executed. And what was so interesting was the last interview he did was with Dr. James Dobson of
Yes, sir.
Focus on the Family.
Yes, sir.
And what they did was basically, at this point, I don't know what Ted Bundy would have been looked upon. I think, did he become a born again Christian at this point before he was executed? Because I think that's what happened, right? So he joins our camp and goes and goes on with Dr. Dobson. And basically it was kind of an opportunity for Dr. Dobson to use it to rail against pornography. Wasn't that kind of like, oh, look what pornography caused them to do this? And it just fit right in with Dr. Dobson's, and he comes from a hard right holiness Church of the Nazarene, very legalistic worldview. And of course, I was raised with a lot of his materials, and unfortunately, and so I want to say that the evangelical world and the Bundy world, there was a lot of convergence going on there, and it looks to me like Ted Bundy was kind of using evangelicals in the same way he was using Latter-day Saints. What do you say to that?
It's that's exactly, you are 100% right. And it's important to note there. By the time as you say, he was using the evangelicals like James C. Dobson, who has his own curious connection to Mormonism at that same time. Is that he had at that time, you say, the way he had used Mormons, by that point in time, he had been excommunicated from the church, which happened after his conviction while he was in prison here in Utah after the conviction for the kidnapping of Carol Duranch. But it's curious. I'd be curious how old you were when you were exposed to that interview with James C. Dobson.
I think, well, what year was that? Was that in 87?
1989. 89 it
89.
should be.
Well, then I would have been around, well, let's see, I would have been around 15 or so.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I
See, I
probably
was
15.
yeah, I was 9. But
Okay.
when I was 14, I enrolled in a kind of private school group that was extremely right wing. Basically, our history textbooks were Cleon Skousen's The First
Oh,
1,000 Years, the second 1,000 years, the third 1,000, 4,000 years, the 5,000 year leap,
Elite,
the making of
5,000.
America.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you remember that. You're a libertarian. Of course, you know the 5,000 year leap.
Of course.
But I don't have to tell you who Cleon Skousen is then.
Nope. Nope.
He was a big deal. Even outside of Mormonism, he's a big deal. Inside of Mormonism, he was a bit controversial, kind of in the Ezra Taft Benson camp, because they were John Birchers, they were Eagle Forum people, they're extremely right-wing conservatives, who the church was trying to, at the time, leading up to Ezra Taft Benson's domain, realm, ministry, whatever you want to call it, the church was trying to tamp down on that. It's like, we got into enough trouble in the past. We're trying to fit in. We're trying to adapt, modernize, and you guys are pulling us down. So the interesting thing about that for me, when it comes to
I just gotta toss this book out here, Thunder from the Right, edited by Matthew Harris. This is a great this is a great book. I had Matt on 3 years ago to talk about this book, and yeah, this is really, really good stuff. So yeah, definitely talks about Skousen and Ezra Taft and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
cool. I have
Right.
to read that. I wasn't even aware of that.
Yeah, it's a good book. Good book. Highly recommend it. Recommend the interview too. I did a 3-parter with Matt 3 years ago. So he's one of my first guests. But yeah, so you have this
And
like,
you
okay,
you
so
get
you're
everybody.
what's that?
You get everybody, man.
I get everybody. That's right. So you're raised kind of like this right wing, ultra orthodox TBM world, right? and
Yes.
you're being educated with, like, the Bircher stuff and like New World Order stuff, conspiracy stuff. At this time you would have been maybe, like suspicious of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was actually right. That was the theory, that it wasn't really. It was actually this whole thing, and that yeah. So there's this conspiratorial mindset, and this right around this time is Pat Robertson's campaign for president in 1988, starts up the Christian Coalition, comes up with a book called The New World Order, which becomes a
Hmm.
bestseller on the New York
Hmm.
Times, and he questions whether this collapse of the Soviet Union is legit. We're in the same wheelhouse here, right? Like
Correct.
we're on the same wavelength. Yeah.
That's
So
right.
we were exposed to very similar ideas. I went to a Christian school here in Florida for a while, that the library received the copy of the New American, every a copy of the New American, the John Birch Society magazine. So I read every issue that I could get my hands on. So we both have very similar backgrounds.
Okay. Okay. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. You understand. That's cool. I like that. I mean, I'm sorry, but I like that. But so okay, so his son-in-law, Cleon Skousen, had a son-in-law named John Kimber, and he started a school called Benjamin Franklin Leadership Academy, or it was called BFA at the time I was in it, and I was a part of that. I was 14, I believe, when we went to and I talk a little bit about this in my book. I went to a conference where Cleon Skousen was speaking, and that was like hushed tones, sir. New Cleon Skousen? Are you kidding me? I mean, this man was like a rock star in my eyes. Are you talking to me, Molly? Yeah, I'm in a meeting. All right, love you.
All right. We don't have to edit that
uh,
out. That happens. That happens. So
yeah,
so
great.
Cleon
That's fine.
Skousen, he's a rock star.
He's a
And
rock star.
let me just back off a little bit, because I have to say that I do think it's good to have a healthy skepticism of big government. And I think that libertarianism is a healthy philosophy that I think needs to be part of the conversation. I think that the issue is the conspiracy stuff that gets intermingled with it, is what I
Mhm.
find problematic. But I think libertarianism as a philosophy is something that I think we need more of. I think it's a good counterbalance to some of the other ideas out there. So I'm not going to poo-poo on all of it. And I do think that, I did, Ron Paul's always going to be a hero to me. I'm sorry, but he's my guy, So I
You should be
just want to lay
sorry.
that out. What's that?
But you should be sorry. No, look, you don't. I will make you apologize for that, and you don't make me apologize for loving Bernie Sanders, and we'll be okay. Uh,
That's fine. Hey, like Bernie used to say, he said Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders used to co-sponsor legislation all the time, and Bernie was a independent, and they would get the Democrat and they would get Ron Paul to sponsor it, and they called a tripartisan legislation. So Bernie Sanders back in the day, if you don't realize this, when Bernie Sanders first ran for Congress, he ran against a liberal Republican incumbent and received the endorsement of the National Rifle Association, and that's what put him over the top. So, there's a lot of there's more cross-pollination between these groups than people realize.
I tell to the libertarians, I say, look, first of all, first thing I know about libertarians is that there's only one. Because if you ever talk to a libertarian, they'll tell you how every other libertarian is not a real libertarian. It's like No True Scotsman Central. It's like a
That's true.
conference of No True Scotsman. Right? It's
Well, do you know
like
what I like
the
to say
reason.
about, but what I like to say about socialists is that, well, or what I like to say about libertarians are socialists that understand economics. So there we go.
That's funny is that I say libertarians are people who are willing to be critical of everything about American government except for capitalism. Other than- You just draw the line at capitalism.
Hey,
So,
well, that's fine.
anyways, yeah, we're definitely coming at two angles of the same thing, I think.
I think so too.
Um, but okay, so I go to Salt Lake and I get to hear Cleon Skousen speak, hush tones, etc. I'm sitting there, about 200 other Mormon teenagers, most of us boys, and the thing that he shows us, they pull up a big projection screen, the conference screen in the chapel, and the thing they project onto the conference screen where the prophets speak is James C. Dobson's interview with Ted Bundy about how Ted Bundy used to steal Playboy magazines out of his neighbor's trash cans and read gory detective magazines and novels. And because of that, that made him everything Ted Bundy was, which is a completely dishonest assessment of the psychology of Ted Bundy, right? But a 14-year-old kid doesn't know that. Any 14-year-old kid's not going to know that. When it was over, and basically he made the argument that if you're taking your kids to the grocery store, Ted Bundy does, and we're supposed to take it as gospel truth. If you take your kid to the grocery store and walk them past the aisles where they have magazines of Good Housekeeping and People Weekly and, et cetera, with these scantily clad women with softcore pornography, as it was called, on the shelves, or even worse, if you're pumping cable television, you can imagine James C. Dobson's vibrations, cable television into your homes. You are making Ted Bundys. Your children are Ted Bundys in the making, because he said everything you can watch on HBO is a million times more graphic than anything I was able to steal out of a neighbor's trash can or in gory detective novels. And so this philosophy of as a man thinketh, so is he, was very prevalent in this focus on the family as it was in the church at the time. We came away from that. There was not a dry eye in the room. And every person in that, all these teenagers, we were traumatized, mortified that we were all the next Ted Bundy. We didn't even know most of us didn't know who this person was, other than people used to say, I do remember when I was a kid, people used to say, Ted Bundy, and then they'd get quiet. There are kids in the room. Don't talk about that. Don't talk about that. But one of the things that they wouldn't talk about was, that he got baptized in Salt Lake. Just shut up. Don't talk about that where the kids can hear it. That was the hushed tone when it comes to Bundy. And here we were taking as gospel truth something the man was obviously doing to try to get a stay of execution from the Florida state governor, who, after years and years of stay after stay and extension after extension, for his having murdered a 12-year-old girl in Florida. Meanwhile, every single one of the murders he did here in Utah, he got away with. I put to you, he got away with all of them. Yeah, he was given the chair in the end. He was given the chair for Kimberly Leach, which honestly, I don't believe in the death penalty, but I can't say it was a bad thing. Honestly, this world needed to have this soul dispatched from it, in my opinion. So it makes me conflicted about that. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, here in Utah, and I just released a 2-hour interview with a man who has written more about the Bundy murders than anybody else. And he said, look, he agreed with me on this. He said, look, in Utah, they have a real problem that they don't keep records, they mishandle evidence, and they mishandle investigations, and they ruin the investigations. And Bundy got away with all those crimes because the way inside Mormon society, he was just basically given a pass to do what he wanted on one side, and on the other side, the police didn't know how to enforce the law. Some of that is 1970s. They didn't know. They didn't know what policing was yet. And a lot of it is today, the police, we basically live in a police state. The police can do what they want. They can say what they want. And if it convicts people, almost nobody questions it. And if you do, you're accused of being Black Lives Matters extremists, or something like that. And so it's like, okay, it's a curious thing. But here's the thing. This guy that I talked to, Kevin Sullivan, I just published a 2-hour interview with him. And he said his first meeting with Jerry Thompson, who called himself a Jack Mormon, the lead detective on the Bundy case, he walks in to a meeting with him and he's carrying a gym bag. And he's like, what, and they're like, what do you got there? He's like, oh, this is Bundy's murder kit. Opens it up, pulls out the ski mask, he pulls out the handcuffs, he pulls out the roll of Glad garbage bags, he pulls out everything that was in Bundy's car when he was arrested. It's like, where did you get this? It's like, oh, when I left the force, I walked into the evidence room and walked out with it. And it's like, what? And it's like, well, the guy'd already been convicted for the kidnapping of Carol Duranch, and Colorado had him. They were, in their investigation, nobody was using it. So he picked it up and carried it off. and he'd been on the lecture circuit training police officers how to catch killers, how to collect evidence using evidence he more or less stole. And he reaches into, it was a really curious, creepy, weird story. He's like, here, he like reaches into Bundy's Glad garbage bags. These are the garbage bags Bundy used to bury girls. And he tears one off and he hands it to one of the guys at the meeting. He's like, here, this is for you. And he tears another one off and gives it to Kevin Sullivan. And it was like, are you kidding me? Ted Bundy's garbage bag. And he still has it. Yep. It's a curious
Crazy. Wow.
thing.
Crazy. Well, you know, it
Curious.
reminds me, last year I had Chris Thomas come on, who was with the Elizabeth Smart family, and just talked about a lot of the botching that the police were doing even not that long ago. So there seems to be a pattern there that we see. It really was incredible, some of the incompetency of the law enforcement and that whole thing.
We are seeing that very thing now with the Tim Ballard situation. I don't know how closely you've been following this,
yeah.
but I have a series called Underground where I'm just following Tim Ballard and the cases it's developing with Operation Underground Railroad and what has fallen out since then. But yeah, the mishandling of evidence is happening right now with Tim Ballard in his situation. So it's like it continues. And it's curious. I only mention that because, as I don't know if you're aware of this, but Ed Smart, the father of Elizabeth Smart, was on Operation Underground Railroad's
Yep.
board
Yep.
and was employed by them. And he left after one operation that he saw in operation, said, Tim Ballard, and said he told, as you may be aware, Lynn Packer talks about this, that in Lynn Packer, for your guests, if they don't know, is an investigative journalist here in Utah. Has broken all the major stories. He is the nephew of President Packer, bastard, and he was this. He goes over that. He said that Tim Ballard. He was sick of Tim Ballard's lies, and he felt like none of his suggestions for aftercare, which is what the Elizabeth Smart Foundation is primarily focused on, none of his suggestions were taken seriously, and that Tim Ballard was taking people's money for an organization that didn't deserve their money, that didn't deserve to take it.
So I don't,
remarkable.
we'll have to talk off the record here when we're done, but just so you know, I've got some deep contacts in that world too. So perhaps we can compare some notes, just so you know, like I've done a lot of true crime stuff with the Daybell case and also with Tim Ballard. And I definitely think I'm going to have probably a panel discussion at some point, and I think we're going to include you on this. I can have Chad Daybell's neighbor on, and a few other people, connections that I have in that world. It's
cool.
Yeah, we can compare notes. We'll do that off camera. So that's really fascinating. So that's man, we could talk about your whole Hellfire Agency thing all day and talk about your latest guest. And of course, this is the Jack Mormon cop who stole Bundy's kit. That's so that's what you're talking about. And yeah, very interesting stuff. So check out Hellfire Agency and the work that he's doing there. Yeah, I've got some. We could probably compare notes here because a lot of people don't realize I there's stuff that will never get on my channel, but that doesn't mean that we don't do the due diligence and don't do the research and don't talk to reporters throughout the world about different people I'm talking to. That's what we do here at MBR, even just to inform the conversation, even if it doesn't see the light of day. So we definitely should do some note comparing afterwards. So Joe, I think it's really interesting because here you are, you're really into this stuff, the corruption that happens in church in general. And I think it's really important to back up here because like I more than anybody have been very critical of a lot of the things that I see in the evangelical world. So I am more apt to be critical of evangelicalism than I am of the Restoration, mostly because that's my camp. And, like my friend Dr. Kyle Bashir said, Jesus didn't turn the tables over in Samaria, in their temple. He did it in his own people's temple in Jerusalem. So I don't feel it's appropriate for me to go to Samaria and flip the tables over because that's not my tribe. My tribe, and you could view it the opposite way. You guys are Jerusalem and I'm Samaria. I don't care. But I just try to be more... I just feel like for 200 years of evangelicals bashing and fighting the Restoration, I feel like I don't want to be another evangelical hater of the Mormons. I want to be a person that's actually a peacemaker and a bridge builder, but also points out that there are issues. And I wanted to ask you before we move on, you had mentioned about you like to cover scandals in the evangelical or the religion world in general. What kind of stuff have you been doing? Like, have you done like the televangelist scandals? Like I mean, man, we could do Jim and Tammy Baker, we could do Oral Roberts, we could do Jimmy Swaggart. I could give you so much stuff, but how much of that in my world have you been kind of delving into?
That's great. I'll say this, as an ex-Mormon, I really see Mormonism and the Restoration movement really as an offshoot of and part of the evangelical
Yes.
movement. And so all these people who are deconstructing, becoming ex-evangelicals and ex-Mormons, we're kind of like in the same world. So I love I actually love that Sumerian. That is a fantastic assessment. I believe in that 100%. I don't necessarily believe that Jesus was a real person. I'm not saying he wasn't, but the story of
Well, I'm going
Jesus,
to have
I was
Derek Lambert on of Myth Vision podcast, so we can talk about that. So
you're going to have Derek on. I love Derek.
yeah,
Derek is a great guy.
I've been in communication with Derek, and I might be going on his program. He might be coming on mine. We're going to probably be doing something in the next couple of months. I believe Jesus was a real person who existed. Just so you know, I think that to me it's beyond dispute. But we could digress. But
Ah,
I do think that's true. I tell people, I said that, the context of the restoration is that it was birthed out of the Second Great Awakening culture. It was birthed
correct.
out of I tell people Joseph Smith was a Methodist exhorter. He was literally like, after the pastor would give his sermon, Joseph Smith would come on afterwards and basically do an altar call. So he was so plugged into the evangelical world that it really does influence the restoration. So there's no question that is true. And,
Hmm.
and and I even tell people, I said that April 6th, 1830 setting was a gathering of born again, spirit filled, Bible believing Christians. Them's my people.
100%.
That's
100%. I'll tell you, in my book, The Korihor Argument, which I'm going to show
yes.
you,
And
even
we
though
and by
nobody
the
can buy
way,
it.
can people get that on Amazon?
Nope.
Where
So
can people
what?
get that book? Because we really need to get that.
Absolutely nowhere. So I'll tell you briefly the story. So I published this through Amazon, put a lot of work into it, designed the cover myself, laid out everything myself and published it through Amazon. Then I went to buy advertising on Amazon. The whole reason that I was giving Jeff Bezos the lion's share of the profits on my book was that I was that Amazon is where readers go to get books. And so I said, and then as soon as I start advertising it, there are going to be people who find this book like they find other books about Mormonism and also other books about atheism. I went to buy advertising and they shut my ads down saying, we don't publish books that criticize religion. We don't promote books that criticize religion. I'm like, you publish memoirs, you're publishing mine. And they're like, no, this is our final decision on the matter. You can't promote a book on Amazon ads that criticizes religion. And I was like, then you can't have any sales of my book. So right now, the only place people can get it, I've been publishing chapters of it on an audiobook format, which is what most people have asked me for. They're like, if that was an audiobook, I'd listen to it. So I've been publishing it for my subscribers at my website, hellfire.agency. And I'm hopefully going to have it complete in the next few weeks and completely published up there so people can listen to it. So
Well, and do you think you'll
unfortunately,
eventually be able to get a hard copy out there too?
I,
Because
I
I'm
do
a hard
think,
copy book guy.
yeah, you're the last. I'll tell you this right now. I'll tell you this, Stephen. This one's going to you with an autograph on it, and
Thank you.
I'm going to make sure it goes
Awesome.
to you. But
That's great.
yeah,
So since we're a book show and we're talking, just tell me, what is the Korihor Argument?
okay, so you are and we'll just update so that anybody who finds this is not in the Mormon world,
Right. Good.
who right, who Korihor
Yeah,
was.
who's Korihor? Yeah.
Korihor is the primary atheist character in the Book of Mormon, and he is also the crux of my first seed of doubt that Mormonism was not true, and that the Book of Mormon is not true, and that I had to fight with all throughout all of my shelf breaking years, the shelf bending years, if you will. That's a euphemism for people who aren't aware. In Mormonism, there's this idea, this doctrine that if you have a doubt about the church, instead of letting it break your faith, you put it on the shelf and you just hold it, put it up on a shelf, and you'll deal with it at some other time, which I think pretty much everybody of faith does with some aspect. There are parts of the Bible that cause people to doubt. There are parts of the story of Christianity cause people to doubt. And so they put it up on the shelf. And I tell people all the time, this is something I, as an ex-Mormon, tell Mormons all the time when they confide in me. Don't tell me, when they ask me, Joe, don't tell me anything that's going to make me leave the church. And I'm like, you really think I have that kind of power? I'm like, and I tell them, look, I'm going to tell you something as an ex-Mormon whose shelf has broken. For you people out there who are worried about your bending shelf, the doubt that's going to break your faith is not in the future. It's in the past. The longer that you have a doubt up on that shelf, the heavier it gets. And that's what you don't know. Take that doubt. If you want to stay in the church, take the oldest doubt that you've got and start addressing that. Because while other doubts will mount up on top of it, it's the oldest one that'll be the first one you talk about when you leave the church. Will be, I knew from the time I was X years old that this church was not true, and I tried to save it. I tried to be a good person, because to be a believer, to believe in the presence of doubt, is a moral virtue inside the church, and I would say inside faith in general. It's like, here I have my doubts, but I choose to believe. This is obvious to me or apparent to me. If I think critically about it, this isn't true, but I choose to believe, and that's what makes me a good person. And that's what's making me more qualified for God's grace, or what have you, to be covered by the blood of Christ, or what have you. And I look at that and I say, you look at this, I guarantee you, I've talked to one ex-Mormon after another, after another, after another. Your shelf breaker is the oldest doubt you have. And for me, it was Korihor, because I read it. I remember reading it as a kid. And there's this debate that Korihor has with three prophets or priests. One is Ammon, if I remember correctly, the son of Mosiah, a son of Mosiah. And then the second one is Giddonah, the high priest and judge over the land of Gideon. And the third is Alma, who's like top prophet. He's top dog in Alma chapter 30. And I read through it the first time and I went, Korihor won this argument. From the time I was very little, I was like, Korihor wins this argument. And I ask Mormons to this day, I cannot get a good answer out of a Mormon apologist today. Show me how Korihor does not win this argument, because he totally does. And he makes an epistemological case. And he said, where he says, this is the mistake that all of the prophets that he debates in Alma 30 get wrong, and every Mormon I know gets wrong, is all of them think that Korihor says that there is no God, in spite of the fact that in the Book of Mormon, in Alma 30, he repeats himself multiple times and says, I did not say that there is no God, but I do not believe that there is a God. And except you show unto me a sign, yea, show unto me that he hath power, I will not believe. So in other words, he's making the argument that faith is intellectually bankrupt if it is completely absent of empiricism, of empirical and or rational explanation, evidence. And then at the end of the debate, the way it ends up, for as you I'm sure know, Stephen, is that Alma says, if you want a sign, here's a sign, and he strikes him dumb, which in some parts of the story says that it indicates that he struck him deaf, and others that he struck him mute. Obviously, apparently, that he struck him mute. That the idea was supposed to be that God would not have him corrupt the community anymore, so he shut him up, so that he literally shut him up forever. And then at the end of the day, he gets trampled to death by Zoramite teenagers. And sometimes he's described as deaf, sometimes as dumb, and sometimes as just one or the other, which is an interesting corollary. It's an interesting problem. It was very clear to me from the time I was very young that whoever's telling this story didn't think it all the way through. I used to call it the out to lunch explanation. I think Joseph Smith got hungry as he got through it. You get hungry and you get like hypoglycemic, and you start to get to, where was I going with this? And if you're staring into your hat, at some point, if you get hungry enough, you're going to be like, And then he went out and got trampled to death by Zormite teenagers. That's lunch. Okay, thanks a lot, people. Here we go. And that's, for me, that's what happened with Korihor, is that once he had said it, once they had written it down, he couldn't take it back. And the curiosity for me is, if Joseph Smith did write the Book of Mormon, and I don't know that he did, I find very good, reasonable suspicion that it could have been Oliver Cowdery who contributed this section. It could be the influence of Sidney Rigdon. It's not outside of the realm of plausibility for me, even though supposedly they didn't know. Okay, fine. Solomon Spaulding. There are all kinds of plausible explanations, right? But I tend to default to best evidence we have for it, in my opinion, is it's Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith wrote it. Either Joseph Smith wrote it, in my opinion, it's either Joseph Smith wrote it or he found some document and actually did translate it.
And you're taking a naturalistic position on this whole thing, and I think that yeah, I think adding any more characters to the story, I think, in just making a naturalistic argument, I think that Joseph Smith was involved, whether he was translating, seeing things in, whether he's using the Urim and Thummim, he's using the seer stone, whatever instrument is being used, how it's ever being done. I think that Joseph Smith I think it's being revealed to him, whether it's coming from inside or out, or he's, from inside his head, or what he's seeing there. I think Joseph Smith is the most likely person to be involved. So I'm glad, yeah, because I think all the other stuff is just a little too conspiratorial for me. But that's just
that's curious. That's very curious, because I don't entirely disagree with that, and I find that intriguing that you would say that. I've made this case before, and people laugh at me. I say, what about the possibility that Joseph Smith hallucinated? And they laugh and they say, you've got no reason to believe that. You have the Book of Mormon, you have the first vision, you have the various conflicting accounts of the first vision. You have these the stories and the varieties of the experiences of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. It speaks very much to me of people who were seeing different things from their eyes, from their perspective, and people who are remembering things differently over time, especially Joseph Smith. There's a reason why Gordon B. Hinckley pulled out his personal checkbook and bought the Salamander letter off of Mark Hoffman. And that reason is because even President Hinckley knew it was plausible, okay, that Joseph Smith did claim his first vision came from a salamander who crawled out of the river. And so you look at this and I say, this to me looks very much like a person who may have had schizophrenia. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist. I can't diagnose that. Or a person who had some kind of psychosis, or a person who is, and probably the most plausible explanation, who was a narcissist and a pathological liar. He knew that he had to make up stories that were more and more fantastical for reasons that seem very plausible to me. And so it's like, but at the same time, I read the Book of Mormon with the surface reading that some people like Jared Hickman, we had a conversation about that Dr. Bushman, his organizations like the Latter-day Saints for the Arts or something like that, that they're sponsoring. One of the scholars they're sponsoring, as I believe, is a professor, don't quote me on this, at Johns Hopkins or something like that. And his name is Jared Hickman. Very curious to see if he's a descendant of Wild Bill Hickman, a guy right, who's kind of an anti-hero fascination of mine. But he claims that if you take a surface reading of the Book of Mormon, you see that people open it up and read the story, and the historical anachronisms in it are proof that it was not a historical document. He doesn't come out and say it that way, Jared Hickman, who is, I believe, Mormon still. And he said, but that's the proof that it is scripture, because scripture was always more or less a story meant to drive people to faith. And I believe that. I actually agree with that, because I look at the story, the more I look into the story of the Gospels, that's exactly what I see. The Luke Acts cycle, you ask me, I mean, this is the best evidence I know, the Luke Acts cycle, that early Christianity was invented by second and third century persons, as at least as we understand it today. And it's like, but in those times, they didn't really care whether or not this is the exact story of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, who was, an itinerant preacher in Second Temple Judaism. They didn't care. They weren't talking to people who lived in first century, Second Temple Judaism. They were talking to people in their time, and they were trying to expand the work that they were doing at their time. In the second, third, fourth centuries, it's not a surprise that we see the Bible grow longer and longer and longer and longer as they put more and more and more and more stories that we can trace back to and say, okay, this is probably the person who invented this story or somebody like them. There's a very good operating theory out there that Polycarp probably wrote much of the Luke Act cycle, or invented parts of the Luke Act cycle, including the first two chapters. So it's like you look at this and say, oh, if I look at this from an outside point of view and I say, okay, if we see this as people trying to preserve a historical event as it historically happened, we are looking at it from the perspective of an Enlightenment society. People who believe if you're going to write it down, you better have verified with proof and testimony, witnesses that it actually happened in the outside physical material world, that it was a thing that happened, because that's our value system. But they had a different value system. Their value system, whether or not it happened in history, was nowhere near as important as whether or not it made people believe. And that's the way the Bible was written. I believe Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, or somebody like that, wrote the Book of Mormon in exactly that way. And so I think that they're onto something there to say, effectively, I joke, we talked about this before. When I saw that interview, and there was an interview done by Luke, this guy from Ward Radio, whose name you may be aware of. I hadn't recorded that upstairs, where he talks with Dr. Bushman, and that turned me on to this explanation exists out there for the Book of Mormon, and that they're putting some plausibility behind it. I looked at that and said, oh, so effectively, the fact that the Book of Mormon is not true is the proof that it is true. That's a new take, you ask me, and one that I find more plausible, at least, than the ones I've heard. At least, certainly the ones that I got from Jacob Hansen and his debate with Trent Horn. So, anyways,
well, that's interesting. It's interesting because I deconstructed the Bible as an atheist. So a lot of what you're saying like resonates with me. Like, oh yeah, and I returned to faith not because of apologetics or because of arguments. I returned to faith because I just did. And I don't need to give you an argument or an explanation or an apologetic defense of my faith, because I feel like this is the frustration part for me, okay? Is Trent Horn, I felt, just basically was just rehashing old stuff, didn't bring anything new to the table, nothing interesting. And I felt like, Jacob did, I think, a decent job. I complimented him as debates go. I felt that he won. But what really frustrated me and caused me to say a not so nice thing on my Facebook page that evening was when he released a video where he gave the 5 reasons why you shouldn't trust the Book of Mormon or believe it. And number 5 was the Catholic Church is true, therefore the Book of Mormon can't be. And to me, that's apologetics right there. That's basically what apologetics is to me. My particular faith is the true one, therefore yours can't be true. And that's
Bingo.
Kind of the foundation of apologetics arguments. And that's why I tell people, and actually you probably haven't heard this story, but I actually told it on Mormon Stories, is this book here by Josh McDowell, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Okay. So this was Josh McDowell is like a Christian apologist, and his Sean McDowell is his son, and he's a Christian apologist as well.
That I know.
So
that name I know.
Okay, you know that name. So I'm literally like younger person, and like, oh, the Apostle Paul says you need to have a ready answer. And again, I told this story a couple years ago on Mormon Stories, right? And I was like, well, I've never really studied Christian apologetics. And I remember thinking, like, because in my mind, there were these great defenders of the faith that were going to college campuses, and they were going and they were defending Christianity, and they were just beating them in all these arguments and debates. And I just kind of thought, well, they're doing their job. I can focus on other things. So I thought, I really need to be prepared here to have a ready answer. So I'm going to start looking at Christian apologetics. So I opened up that book, and Josh McDowell goes and says that the Bible can be scientifically verified. I'm like, wow, scientifically verified. So I'm like,
Hmm.
I got to look at the footnote here, what he's using, and he uses James.
Yeah, that's a claim.
Yeah, he uses Whitcomb's Genesis flood that came out in 1960 as
Oh,
scientific evidence.
oh my
And I
gosh. Why not
realized,
William Paley's natural theology? I mean, dear God, man.
oh my gosh. So I'm like, at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, Houston, we got a problem here. Because any atheist that's going to pick up this book and use that footnote, that obliterates the whole entire argument. That if you're using a book that's already been discredited, arguing a young earth creation, Noah's flood, all this kind of stuff, and that's your scientific basis, no scientist is going to take you seriously. And then I
Sure.
thought, that's when the aha light bulb went up for me, when I realized that, oh, Christian apologists are not about defending the Christian faith. They're about keeping Christians in the faith by giving just good enough answers that for most people, like, oh, okay, great. I was just wondering because so-and-so brought this up to me. That's a good answer, Pastor. Thank you. And just give good enough answers. But this is the thing. I left the evangelical village 20 years ago. I come back to it a few years ago, and the village is on fire. And it's become an absolute disaster. And I get so frustrated with these Christian apologists, and many of them don't like me and they attack me because I'm precisely making the point. Like, guys, you are built your foundation on a very sandy surface. It's not a good foundation. And this is my final point, and then I want you to kind of rant. Is this
Okay.
is
Oh,
that
good.
if you think you can make arguments to get people into your religion, guess what? Arguments can get people to get out of your religion too. And if atheists, to me, make better arguments than Christian apologists do. So for those of you who became Christians as a result of Christian apologetics, let me make a prediction. Within 5 years, you're going to be an atheist if you're following the arguments. That's the point I'm trying to make. So that's what I want to say. Joe, what do you have to say?
Fair enough. Fair enough. And I think that's a very insightful look at things, Stephen. This is why I like your program, is because I see an atheist amount of reasoning in a believer's environment. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I get it. It's curious to me that, as now an atheist, and I've been an atheist, I just turned 44 last week. And so I realized that I returned from my mission basically an atheist, a closet atheist, couldn't talk to people about, not that being atheist is anything like being gay, Stephen. That's not saying the closet atheist, but an atheist who couldn't tell people he was atheist. That I lost my faith on my mission in Peru. But that that was 21, so I now have officially more or less been an atheist longer than I was Mormon, and that's like blowing my mind right now. But this is the thing that I think apologists like Jacob Hansen don't get about atheists, is that our ready answer is, my opinion changes with new information. And this has been long-standing, and you know it very well. Sam Harris once gave a talk, which he was cursed off the stage to a group of atheists, a skepticon. But I think he was right. Sam Harris is one of the most, is one of the most well-established, celebrated atheists in the world. And that he had suggested that we should stop using the label atheist. And he said, because atheism has no content, which I agree 100%. People say that it's a religion. I'm sensitive to the fact that you're one of them, Stephen. I disagree entirely, because first of all, I can criticize atheism all that I want, and nothing happens to me. But atheism at the end of the day doesn't describe who we are. It doesn't describe what we believe. Most atheists I know love outer space, love all the things you can learn about outer space, but so do a lot of believers. But we just happen to look at it and say, yeah, but we're always going to be learning new things because we're learning about outer space for what it is, an understanding of the universe for what it is, right? Not what trying to learn to know God better, which most atheists are doing that. They're trying to close their God, the gaps that their God is in, rather than expand the gaps that their God is in, right? And so I look at this and I say, look, the thing that you look at this debate between Jacob Hansen and Trent Horn, watch it again and ask anybody out there, I would challenge. If you haven't watched it, watch it and ask yourself every time Jacob answers a question, ask yourself, is he listening at all to what the other guy is saying and asking himself, do I have this wrong? Did I get this wrong in any way? Yes, they are old arguments. The reason why Trent Horn is bringing up old arguments is that some of them are good. One of the best criticisms of the debate I read was in the comments of that. I don't know if it was in the comments of, isn't it Pints with Aquinas they were on? Somebody on there had made the comment and said, somebody really needs to talk to Mormon and Christian apologists about the argument from silence. And I'm like, oh, perfect. That's exactly it. The apologists who use, like Jacob Hansen, who use the argument from silence, it is for me one of the greatest hypocrisies that there is. Because the argument from silence is that an absence of evidence is evidence of absence. You know, that when Jacob Hansen mentions, how do you explain Joseph Smith having put into the Book of Mormon names with Hebraic origins, Hebrew origins, that he could not have known about at that time period? And Trent Horn answers to him, again, like you said, with old counter arguments about this. Those documents were published in the time. They were being distributed in the time. They were accessible to Joseph Smith at that time. And he comes back and says, where's your proof that Joseph Smith had those books? And I look at that and I go, ooh, that's okay. First of all, the easiest answer in the world, show me your photograph of Joseph Smith's bookshelf and I'll show you mine. The fact that there were books published on the subject that Joseph Smith might have had access to is proof in and of itself. And you want proof that he had access to those books. The Book of Mormon is your proof. The Book of Mormon is the proof, Jacob, is that those names are on there. Now, how did he get access to the books? We don't have to answer that question to say, okay, wait a minute. From a historical point of view, you have to say it's at least plausible. For example, and I'm not saying this is the reason, I'm just saying this is a plausible answer for me. Like you said, Stephen, Joseph Smith attended camp meetings. He attended revivals. He was very well known in the area that was called the Burnt Over District of New York at that time. He was part of that cycle. Now, did Joseph Smith himself go to a seminary? No, but his brother Hiram did. Did Joseph Smith ever preach with the Restoration preachers at the time? No. But Oliver Cowdery did, and Parley P. Pratt did, and the Hyde brothers did, and of course Sidney Rigdon did. And Sidney Rigdon is one of the biggest names at the time in that region. So it's like, to say Joseph Smith couldn't have had access to these sources because there's no accounting for that is like, for me, I take the example, it's like the difference between criminal court versus civil court. In criminal court, because somebody might lose their freedom or their life, the standard is you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a high bar. In civil court, you just have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence. Well, similarly, in history, if you're going to look at history, you have to be able to admit we don't have enough evidence to be able to say beyond a reasonable doubt. So you've got to go at least back down to by a preponderance of the evidence. Is there a plausible explanation? And I think there's definitely a plausible, everything that, you say old arguments, right? I don't know of any argument, maybe I haven't listened carefully enough. I don't know of any argument that Jacob Hansen makes that wasn't at one point made by Hugh Nibley, which are the most, in my opinion, intellectually bankrupt arguments that are out there. Hugh Nibley was just frankly was not a very good historian. He was not, he was not, I think, an altogether particularly intelligent person. And I will get even ex-Mormons who will call me out on that and, smear my name with mud. But I'm fine with it. If I can take Mormon criticism, I can take Exmos hitting me. Yeah, hit me, baby. Let's go. So,
Yeah, no,
anyways,
I know what it's like to hear it from all the different directions. But
you and I are in that. You and I will stand. I tell you, Stephen, you and I will stand arm in arm, face back, and we will just go around kicking everybody. That's what we'll do.
well, and I think, and I love having conversations with people like you that are original thinkers, that are bringing something to the table. I do feel that the issue that I have with a lot of these apologetics is groups, and this applies to the Mormon apologists, this applies to the Christian apologists, and all these groups, is that, you know, I think if you don't understand Joseph Smith, let me put it this way, if you don't have an imagination, you cannot understand Joseph Smith. And if you're a Mormon apologist and you lack imagination, you don't get Mormonism. You don't understand it. So your foundation is Joseph Smith had a vivid imagination. Everybody knows that he did. His grandmother attests to it. He was brilliant. He was a genius. He was remarkable. I mean, this was not some semi-literate farm boy who was some backwoods hick. This was a nation builder. This was a general of one of the largest standing armies in America. This is a man who's building an empire. This is a man who's capable of so much. To say that he's not capable undersells who he was as a remarkable historical person, period. Full stop. Just a remarkable person. So to me, it's an argument of, I think so many people try to make him into some ignorant farm boy. Look, we know about the Dartmouth, that he was exposed to that. We know through Jonathan Neville's work, what he did with Jonathan Edwards. We know that he was exposed to the teachings of Jonathan Edwards. It permeates the Book of Mormon immensely. So we know that he was definitely, there's just no doubt now that Joseph Smith had all these things available to him. Look, we know that there were maps in the Middle East that had Nahum on it. So whether he had access to those maps or not, we don't know, but they did exist. So and again, I'm Mr. Love the Restoration, love the Book of Mormon. I can go and make a naturalistic argument, which I've done with Joseph with on Mormon stories, but I would love to do a faithful argument in favor of the Book of Mormon with Christian apologists, because I think I can make both debates. So I'm thinking on different levels here, which I love to do, because again, you need imagination to do this kind of thing. And I think it's so important to have an imagination to be able to kind of tap into what Joseph Smith was able to tap into. I feel like there's a real strong kinship that I have with the man in that way. And once you have an imagination, and you're not trying to become the next Hugh Nibley, you're not trying to become the next Dan Peterson, but you're actually bringing something to the table that's interesting and unique. That's good. That to me, that's why I get what you're saying, Joe, about Trent. All he needed to do was make the old arguments, because they still haven't necessarily been, all dealt with, which is true. But I also want to have new information to the table. That's what I like about you. You have an imagination. You're able to think outside of the box, and I think that's the kind of people that need to engage Joseph Smith, or people like that, because he was that way. And if you're not that way, you'll never understand Joseph Smith, and you'll never understand Mormonism.
I agree 100%. And the curious thing to me about that is, I take this Korihor argument, right? Like I was saying, I look at this, if you look at this from a naturalistic perspective, which I think is the most reasonable perspective to look at it, I'm willing to concede that I don't know. Joe, do you know ExmoJoe, as I have come to be known? ExmoJoe, do you know that Joseph Smith did not have the power of God to translate ancient documents? No, I don't know. Okay. I plainly admit that. But I don't believe, as Korihor says, but I don't believe it. And except thou shalt show me a sign, I will not believe, because I think that everything deserves to have some critical thinking. And if you don't apply critical thinking to that principle, you might be confused by what Korihor calls a frenzied mind. You get this idea from the perspective of your own bias. And when you're not willing to challenge it, you have abandoned the examined life. You have abandoned the pursuit of intellectual learning, right? But when I look at it from, if I take myself out of the anti-Mormon space, right? I can leave the church, but I can't leave it alone. But I find the story of Korihor and Alma to be one of the most fascinating insights into Joseph Smith's mind, given that Joseph Smith is the author of the Book of Mormon, which I don't know. And I think it's plausible he wasn't. But it's also plausible that he was. And if he was, who is Korihor? Why did Joseph Smith constructed an argument where, in my opinion, the believer concedes, Alma concedes the argument. The first believer makes no answer, Ammon, he forfeits. The second believer, Gedona, in the land of Gideon, makes the case that, why do you preach against this, that there should be a Christ when he gives these people so much hope? And yea, you have all the prophets as your witnesses, as your sign. And he says, and Korihor goes down a detailed list of why it is, and he goes over it again and again, why it is that it's unreasonable to believe on faith that God exists and that Christ will come on the basis of Lockean. He talks about Lockean tabula rasa. He talks about empiricism. He talks about rationalism. He talks about ecclesiastical abuse, which is extremely important in this day and age, when there's now a lawsuit going against the church. I'm sure you've heard about this, the Huntsman lawsuit, where people are trying to recover their tithing from the church, saying that we gave you tithing on the basis of a lie, right? He laid all these arguments out, and then they didn't make any solid arguments, with the exception of Alma makes one point. He says, you know that we have not taken one C9, which is supposedly a unit of Nephite currency, beyond what we need, beyond what we require, so we don't go saying we glut ourselves on the wealth of the people. Okay, fine, concede 1 point. But other than that, Korihor wins, and then at the end, Alma strikes him dumb with the power of God, which even the chief judge who's observing this, he's like the moderator, if you will, observes, you have seen a sign, you have seen that God hath power, now will you believe? Now we can talk about what happens after that, but I want to get to that point. The whole point that Korihor was making throughout the whole argument was that you couldn't believe except there was some kind of empirical and or rational evidence to believe. And at the end, Alma gives him exactly that, and in my opinion, concedes the debate. In that moment, I look at this and say, if I'm looking at this and being generous to Joseph Smith, sitting there with his face in his hat, or with his, looking down the breastplate with his seer stones or what have you, right? And I think, what is going on in this young man's mind? And I think this young man knew complex theological arguments about teleological arguments for the existence of God, and even, I would say, plausibly the ontological argument for the existence of God, which in my opinion is the best one that there is. So also the one that proves that God doesn't exist, but we can talk about that another time. But but this is a young man who had some exposure to theology, to theological arguments, and Korihor is his super ego. It is that part of his brain, his psyche, that challenges it and says, I think I'm wrong, that doubts. That's the part of Joseph Smith's brain that doubts. And at the end of Alma 30, I still maintain, probably because he just got hungry and he's like, I think I'm losing the plot. I need to get some food in me, or some caffeine or something, or some booze, or whatever it is that he did to recover from a day of translating. He gets to the end of it and realizes, I got to abandon this. Okay, he's trampled to death by Zormite teenagers and admits that the devil sent him an angel that taught him that God didn't exist. Wait, what? Joseph, that doesn't make sense. Joseph, where are you going? Joseph, that doesn't make sense, Joseph. And it's like, and so I'm looking at that and I'm saying, I defy anybody out there. Show me how Korihor loses, because I'm more convinced he wins, and it's kind of magnificent that he wins, because I finally have a human connection to Joseph Smith. I look at him like, Joseph, you doubt this like I do? Me too, bruh. This is you and me here. The difference is that here you have a young man who was prophesied by his mother from the time he was a boy, pitched by his mother and father and all his family to be a young man of significant spiritual abilities that were not available to most people at the time. And he had to live up to that. And when his brother Alvin died, this family was destitute, was driven into absolute despair, economic despair. And to make ends meet, he had to go treasure hunting. He had no other skills. So I'm like, you look at the person, a young man who grows up with that circumstance, and to ask him, Joseph, do something else with your life, which, by the way, he tried. We have in his records that when he and Emma went to Harmony, is it Harmony or Harmony Township? And they went, I believe, and in Pennsylvania, he had told her that he was done with church work forever. Joseph Smith had no other skills. He had no education, really. I mean, apart from what he learned from preachers, in my opinion, at the time. And so it's like, and William E. McClellan says that Joseph Smith couldn't even read or write when he met him, but William E. McClellan said a lot of BS. So it could be though. And no, he wasn't a great speller, because we can look at the Happiness Letter, we can look at letters like that and see he wasn't a great speller. But to say he wasn't a phenomenal storyteller and he wasn't able to create scriptural sounding concepts with complex exegesis, look at the Doctrine and Covenants. That's an open and shut case for me. Look at all day. It's there. He knows what he's doing. Look at the book of Abraham. Look at the book of Moses. Look at the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. I agree with you, Stephen, that I think, if anything, Joseph Smith was more or less a genius who was motivated by material problems and by a history of maintaining this legacy, that if that's because he was born in the call or what have you, that he was a magical being, that he had these magical abilities, as believed by his own family members, that he had to live up to it. And I think it was a lot of pressure on him. And it's no wonder to me that he drank. It's no wonder to me that he had to have a revelation that alcohol was being prepared by the enemies of the church to try and corrupt him. And that long after he died, people had provided defenses for him that, okay, Joseph Smith would drink. He would drink a couple of beers, but he'd never get drunk, he'd never get smashed. And then you see these accounts, even in like Rough Stone Rolling, Joseph Smith Rough Stone Rolling, where some guy comes in, declares Joseph Smith is a fraud and a liar, and Joseph Smith takes him out in the street and beats him so badly, basically beats him blind. And he loses his mind with his temper. His brother William, they had to break them up, tear them off of each other, because he would get violent. This to me speaks volumes about a man who was under serious psychological pressure and had to drink more or less to calm his nerves, to control it. But the booze probably drove him to violence. And so it's like, I'm looking at this from a perspective, say, if I'm being generous with Joseph Smith, not putting my usual anti-Mormon hat on and saying Joseph Smith was a liar, Joseph Smith was this, he was a womanizer, so on and so forth, which I do think is true. I look at it and say, he was still a human being. And to say he didn't have mental illness is just based upon a kind of stigma about mental illness that says, let's assume no one has mental illness until they're diagnosed. Well, that's a terrible assumption to make. Mental illness is so common. Depression is so common. I'm a big fan of a man named Dr. Rollo May, who basically makes the case that anxiety is the most common thing in the world. Yes, general anxiety. He called it existential anxiety. He was the first of what were known as the existential psychotherapists. They were therapists. He was a therapist who included in his work the work of philosophers like Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer and Camus and so forth. And to help people understand whether or not your life has meaning, which is great if you can find some meaning in life. Viktor Frankl, in his Man's Search for Meaning, tried to make that case what becomes logotherapy. But in the existential therapy world, Rollo May made the case that, look, we live in a schizoid world. We called it the schizoid world, which is to say you have two worlds inside your mind, and everything you interact with in the world is inside your mind. You've never interacted with the world directly. Everything in your mind, Sam Harris says this, he says, everything you observe from your eyes and your ears is a memory. It's a thought from the past arising in the present, because by the time that the signal reaches from your eye to your brain, or from your ear to your brain, at different rates of speed, by the way, and yet in your mind, you see my lips moving and you hear my voice talking, and in your mind they're synchronized, but we know for a fact that in your brain you're receiving them at different rates, and yet something inside your brain is rebuilding that. That means that every time you see a magic trick, even though you know in the real world, in the physical material world, it's a trick, inside your mind, if your mind is building it, it's magic inside your mind. So he puts the case that you have the world as you see that it should be, and then you have the world as it turns out that it actually is, as you're interacting with it. And when those things don't line up, right, and you see that they don't line up, that's when you're going to experience anxiety. Because if the world is not as you want it to be, as you believe it should be, you start to ask, who am I? How guilty should I feel about my past that you can't do anything about? And then you start worrying about all the things that could happen in the future. Oh my God, what if I lose my job? Oh my God, what if my wife leaves me? Oh my God, what do I do if my kids don't love me? Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And these things, if your world is all that is real to you, and you're imagining all these scenarios, it's happening inside that same world, inside your mind, there's no difference. There's no difference between the pain of the things that are happening to you in the real world and all the possibilities that you're perceiving in the moment with your anxieties. And so every time you worry about the future or worry about a past that you can't change, the argument is you are experiencing things. The Stoics, more than anybody, wrote about this, that you are experiencing pain for possible worlds that don't exist in your actual timeline, in the actual world. And you are mounting it up and mounting it up and mounting it up. And this is every religion, in my opinion, every religion from Buddhism at least forward, and every philosopher, certainly at least from Epicurus forward, and every psychiatrist, every psychotherapist, every psychologist has been trying to resolve this. What are we supposed to do with the schizoid world, Rollo May's schizoid world? How do you reconcile the world as you see it actually is versus the world as you expect it to be?
Well, that was very interesting and well put. And I actually want you to talk a little bit about your existential crisis that you went through. I guess becoming an atheist, that certainly was an existential crisis for me. And I'll mind you that actually, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but it was actually Samuel Harris's book. I read all the Four Horsemen, I read all their books. It was actually Samuel Harris's book, A Letter to a Christian Nation, that was my deconversion moment when I read a particular paragraph that kind of deconverted me. And so that was a moment. That was a moment where I believed, I read the paragraph, and I didn't believe. And it was a powerful moment in my life. And then there is an existential crisis that I went through. Also, before you talk about that, I don't know if you mentioned earlier, but when you first thought that Korihor had won the argument, how old were you when you kind of made that observation? Were you a teenager at the time, or were you a missionary?
It's a good question. I don't know. I remember that the first time I noticed it, I was a teenager. And at
Okay.
that point, I had already had more or less my come to Jesus moment. I had my where I felt like I had accepted Christ and had my salvation moment. And so I tried to put it out of my mind. So it must have been before I was 10
Oh, okay.
that I remember reading it the first time going, that doesn't make sense. And then
Interesting.
several times since then, that definitely came up.
And was
It
that
was
that was your oldest doubt, right? Is that what you would call it?
That's my oldest doubt for
And
sure.
that
Because it's curious. I recently reconstructed this. I said because it was either that or the 116 pages of the Book of Lehi, and I'm like, and I remember that I was in what was known as Webelos at the time, which was both our scout troop, our Cub Scout troop, but also was our priesthood group before we were priesthood holders, right? Because you became priesthood holders when we were 12. And so when I was a young man, we called it Webelos. And I remember it was one of our leaders, one of our teachers in the church who exposed us to this. And I remember saying, oh, I remember hearing something about this from when I was a kid. So I know that, and I remember the Korihor debate was definitely before that, because I remember thinking at the time, it's like that Korihor story that bothers me. So it must have been before I was 11. So yeah, so that's what I would say.
Okay, so now I would like to hear maybe just like, because now this is the question, a lot of people have who are believers,
Mhm.
is how does one live a life of meaning when there's no God, there's nothing, this is it.
Mhm.
What gets you out of the bed in the morning? What's the point of it all? I mean,
Right.
those are simple questions. And by the way, I have to say, every time I look at you, you look like a Franciscan monk with your brown thing. Yeah, I keep on thinking of you being like some
You
atheist
ready
monk.
for the Gregorian chants?
Exactly. But
Deus Requiem. Got to get my board. Um, it's not complete until there's at least one Monty Python reference. I put to you. There's no Monty Python, if there's no Life of Brian references and no references to Monty Python, the Holy Grail, we've wasted our time. We have wasted our. In fact, there's a sketch. I'm sure you probably, if you know Monty Python's Flying Circus. There's a great sketch called the Argument Clinic, and I think you would get a big kick out of that. But I want to answer your question, so I won't digress. But here's the thing: I don't know if I haven't watched your interview with Richard Bushman yet, or any of your videos with Richard Bushman yet. But one of the things I got turned on to with this Ward Radio video recently is Richard Bushman has recently, at least recently, come to grips with, and I don't know if he's told you anything like this, that he had his own existential crisis surrounding Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And I remember looking at that and going, this was just in the last couple of weeks, watching this video and going, that's exactly what Steven Pynakker was saying in his Mormon Stories interview. That, he was tempted by atheism. What it was is they were talking about the new atheists. They were talking about the four horsemen, the new atheists, which is, of course, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Denton,
and
and
Dawkins.
of course Richard Dawkins. Of course, Richard Dawkins. And and so and I remember looking at that and saying, this is a thing nobody's talking about, in my opinion, that I can see, is that whether or not you come back to faith, like Steven Pynakker, who's my friend, I hope I can call you that, and if not, I hope to attain it, to earn it. Whether you go back to faith or you don't, atheism and depression/anxiety seem to go together. And from the believer standpoint, oftentimes I hear people saying, I'm not going to call anybody out by name, but they're there and they know who they are. And you've heard it before, that, oh, if atheists are so right and they're so smart and they're so clever, why are they all depressed and miserable? And I look at that and say, that's looking at it from this caused this, right? The correlation versus causation. I look at it from this causes this, is that, if you look at it and you say, to say that it is to stigmatize that people get depressed is to stigmatize something that's for completely stupid logic, in my opinion. Depression can happen to anyone. It can happen simply because the genes that made your brain are the genes that made your brain, because you inherit it. Anxiety, I would put to you, and I think I think that that Rolame is absolutely right. Absolutely every conscious being experiences anxiety and existential anxiety. Some people are being more honest about it and are willing to be upfront and even public about it, like myself. And that's high for me. Believe it or not, for me, it is a high claim for me, but it's one I make, that I am willing to be public about the fact that I have depression, I have anxiety, and all my life I have had it that I can remember, dating back to when I was a Mormon kid trying to figure out, am I the next Ted Bundy? And that which ultimately drove me to go into my bishop and confess to him that I stole the Braun Panties section out of the Mervyn's catalog when that came in the Sunday newspaper. And I realized after going to listen to Cleon Skousen speak that meant I was the next Ted Bundy. I was going to wind up doing everything Ted Bundy did. And he was like, well, I don't know about that Ted Bundy stuff, but I can tell you this, nobody else. He's like, as the judge in Israel, nobody else in this congregation is experiencing what you're experiencing. And I was like, are you kidding me? And he's like, no. And because he then asked me, he's like, what happens then? And that's when I had to tell him, well, you know what happens then. And he's like, I don't actually. And he's like, so what's involved in that sin particularly? Come on, really? And he's like, yes. And he wanted the details of exactly what I would do when I would turn on. And I gave it to him. I told him and broke down crying, right? Because I was going to become the next Ted Bundy. It was in the cards. It was in the stars for me because I was such a wicked kid. And he's like, this is really disturbing. I think that we should bring your parents in on this. Whoa, guy. I said, no, I really would rather you didn't. And he's like, really? I'm like, yeah, there's no reason to involve Glenn and Rita Rollins in any of this. No, this is you and me and the Lord. He's like, okay, fine, that's not a problem. And then he's like, but I would like you to read this. And then he pulls out this pamphlet that says, for young men only. And I remember looking at it and going, is there a pamphlet for young women only? I mean, and why is there a big stack of this pamphlet if it's a problem that nobody else is having? See, these are the kind of critical thinking things that you're not supposed to employ.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you've heard of this talk. It's a talk, basically the pamphlet is a talk by Boyd K. Packer known as the Little Factory Talk.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Psychological damage to the max, right? And it wasn't until I moved to Utah. So I spent the most of my life, my teenage life, trying not to think about Ted Bundy, trying like hell not to think about Ted Bundy. And then it wasn't until I moved to Utah, and it turns out I live in American Fork, right down the road from a canyon where one of Ted Bundy's victims was found. Her name was Laura Ann Amy, and Bundy got away with it. Got away with everything he did to her. And I won't regale your viewers who are not into true crime and may be sensitive about these types of stories. It's graphic. It is horrifying. And so I started covering it for Hellfire Agency, which I happened to start at that time, and did more and more investigating about Ted Bundy. I knew, down the road that the reason that as I learned more about Ted Bundy, unwillingly, people told me, he grew up in a household where his father was really his grandfather, and his mother was treated as his sister. And he was willing to believe that all his life until he discovered for himself that it wasn't true, that he was born to his sister in a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont. And everybody had lied to him about that his whole life. And his father/grandfather was a drunk who would beat Ted. And that's why his mother took him out of her father's home and fled with an army and cook in the army whose name was Bundy. And that's how Theodore Robert Culpeper became Theodore Robert Bundy. And I was like, that didn't make it into the James C. Dobson interview, did it? Or the fact that when he was a teenager stealing out of his neighbor's trash can, stealing Playboys out of there, he also would go to like jewelry stores and stuff and boost items from there because he was a kleptomaniac. That didn't get into there. And then around the day that I went and saw that, and I know I'm not answering your question, but I think you're interested in this, so I'm going to keep going with it. That day, I went home to my aunt's house in Salt Lake City, here in Salt Lake City. And my aunt Abby is a GD hero. I'm trying very hard not to swear on your program, Stephen. You're welcome for that. She was a lesbian. I didn't know that at the time. I thought she and my aunt Cindy were just very, very close. I knew Aunt Cindy wasn't my actual aunt, but I knew they were very close because they even shared a bedroom. It wasn't until I was 16 that my mother and I were out, and we had a conversation, my mom and I, who I credit, Mormon woman that she is. She's also a woman who has a degree in childhood psychology, and for all the shortcomings that she has, because she's a human being like any of us, I credit her a lot with the things that she taught me about psychology. But she had told me when I was 16, I on my 16th birthday, actually, I told her, I've been thinking a lot about that Ted Bundy interview and worried about it. And the conversation I had with Aunt Abby that day. And she said to me, and she said, your Aunt Abby is gay, right? I was like, really? And she's like, yes, Joseph, your Aunt Abby and your Aunt Cindy, yeah, they're both gay. They're married to each other. Oh, oh, so Cindy knows. Yeah, Cindy knows, Joe. I'm like, oh, they're lesbians. Because I tell you this, for my 16-year-old brain, that is not what lesbians were. That is not what lesbians were at all. I won't describe to you what my 16-year-old brain thought lesbians were. But what happened was that day I came home and my Aunt Abby was curious. She was like not practicing the faith at the time because she was gay. And at the time, she was the founder, or one of the founders of the Rape Crisis Center in Salt Lake City. And she spent years of her life with Mormon men breathing down her neck, by the way. She would go on the radio and she would consult with women who would say, I hear you talking about things like if he wants it, but I don't want it, then I have a right to say no. But that's like, this is my husband. It's not possible for your husband, to violate you. And she would be the one to say, yes, it is. It's absolutely possible. If you don't want it, you don't have to give it. And if you are forced to give it or feel compelled to give it in any way, that is rape. That's what it is. It's non-consensual. And then she would get these calls from men who would say, how dare you? These are Mormon men, in the community. How dare you? She used to get death threats. She would get threats of violence. And this woman stood up, stood tall for women in this community. And I came home that day, not thinking, I'm a 14-year-old kid. I don't know how to navigate any of this. And she asked me, she said, what did you guys talk about today in the big Cleon Skousen meeting? And I told her, and she goes, why would he show you that? And I said, well, because of softcore pornography. And I gave her the whole sermon. In this society that's fallen away, we have this pride-based society that won't admit that we live in God's direction, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, yeah, okay, break it down. I'm like, oh yeah. So basically, if you have cable television, you're the next Ted Bundy. And she's like, excuse me. She's like, are you kidding me right now? She's like, okay, I know that you're Mormon and your mother's going to get very uncomfortable. My mom's in the room, hiding her face, trying not to participate in any of this. The only input my mom had on that situation, she said, I remember when those murders were happening and we were terrified because my mom was a young woman, a young girl when that happened. And I was in 1974 and 1975. She's like, we were so terrified. And my Aunt Abby said to me, she said, I'm going to tell this to you once, and I hope you remember it, Joe. Rape is not about sex. The church wants you to believe that because they want you to believe that it has to do with somebody not obeying their teachings and their commandments. But that's not what it was about for Bundy or for any of these men. It's about power. It's about taking from somebody else something they can't get back. And she said, and they know full well at the church. And Cleon Skousen knows full well that that's the case, but they don't want it to be true because they want it to be about that you disobey God, this is how this will come out for you, because that makes you reliant on the church. And I remember thinking that that explanation made so much more sense than what Cleon Skousen taught me. It made so much more sense. I can tell you later when I read Boyd K. Packer's talk and the little factory talk, which I had heard before, by the way. I remember looking at it again. I'm sure you were familiar with basically he makes the case, Boyd K. Packer, in that for young men only, and the little factory talk, that he tells the story. Have you read that talk? Are you familiar with it, Stephen?
Oh, I'm definitely familiar with it. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I know I probably watched the video years ago. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. So I'm very familiar with that. Yes.
So he makes the argument in it, then you're aware, that basically he talks about a missionary who came up to him when he was visiting at a mission. And as he was talking to this missionary, the missionary had been brought to him for discipline, to decide whether or not the missionary needed to be disciplined, to decide if he had to be sent home or something like that. And he said that he wanted to know. So he finally said, "Look, elder, just tell me bluntly, what's going on? What are you in trouble for?" And he says that the young man told him, "I hit my companion." And he says, "Oh, is that it?" Which I thought was remarkable. I'm like, that's no joke, man. That's violence. I mean, Jesus said to turn the other cheek. I didn't know at the time. My grandfather, when he was on his mission, beat the crap out of one of his companions. Anyway, but he said, when the young man explained to me what it is that his companion had done, he congratulated him and said, I'm butchering this quote because I haven't read it in years, but he's basically said, "Elder, it's better that you had done that than that an apostle of the Lord had done it," basically. And it was not explained beyond that, except to say, if you have a habit of relieving your own little factory, eventually you're going to become a missionary like this one who got decked out. In other words, at least, of course, it doesn't say it explicitly, but the way it was made to understand to me was that the way young men become gay is by relieving their own little factory. And I remember thinking that was the most terrifying concept anybody could have introduced to me at the time. That was, in my mind, especially growing up in a patriarchal society, in a Mormon environment, in Mesa, Arizona, very right-wing Republican conservative area, to be gay was the most horrifying thing that could happen to you. Like, better you were dead, literally better you ended up dead than that you ended up gay. And I remember thinking, is this true? I mean, he's a prophet of God. How would he, if anybody knows, he knows. And I remember being absolutely mortified by that experience. But at the same time, I had this thought going on in my brain that said, it's just like what Aunt Abby told me. It wasn't about sex. They'll try to make everything about sex because they know everybody thinks about it. And they want you to be reliant on the church to teach you about these things. And they want you to feel guilty because that makes it easier to control you. And it's really about power. But in this situation, who is the one who's trying to take power? I'm like, and it was hard to put out of my mind. This is the church trying to take power over me. This is the church trying to weaponize my feelings, natural feelings, even they admit natural feelings, against me, against myself, so that I will be a faithful tithing payer, so that I will go out and preach the gospel, so that what's the reason? Who's to say? But then you have Korihor tells Alma, tells Gedona, tells Ammon. They do this to glut themselves on the people and to submit the people to them so that they will be obedient. And once again, here on the shelf and shelf, 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 shelf. And it just starts to bow. I could put up with Joseph Smith in the Book of Lehi, that the Book of Lehi is proof positive, and I think it is proof positive. Joseph Smith made up the Book of Mormon. And I can tell you today, if I knew that was true, as I feel I do, I could probably still be a Mormon. I could have stayed with it. Truth be told, I loved being Mormon. There were several things about being Mormon I absolutely loved. And being a priesthood holder was among them. I loved the concept of being a priesthood holder. And there was so much about it that I got out of it, and meaning particularly that I got out of being Mormon. I would never have left, I think, if it weren't for the fact that as I became more and more involved in the church, and as I started to preach, make the sausage of faith as a missionary in Peru, I started to realize we are trying to take advantage of other people's credulity. That we are turning their good name against them to try and convince them to put their reputation on the line. There's a reason why we wore black name tags. I wore a name tag that said Elder Rawlins. It's my grandfather's name. It's my father's name. It's the name of a whole history of my white ancestry. My mother's ancestry is not born on there. Probably it would be if I'd been born in Mexico. In Mexican culture, I'd be Elder Rawlins Maestas, or Maestas Rawlins, I guess. But and I think that was a way of getting us to put our face out there and defend the church and make it part of our story for shame-based reasons. It makes total sense to me then that Martin Harris, even when he wasn't in the church, that Martin Harris never denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon. They believe the Book of Mormon is true. He was tied up in it. That Emma Smith, who found out all those nasty details about what Joseph Smith had done, especially with those teenage girls, denied that they ever happened, and affirmed to the day she died that the Book of Mormon, the story of the Book of Mormon is true. Of course she did. Her story was involved in it. This is how narcissists behave. Narcissists get other people to compromise themselves and to get up, and you'll see it. If you look in your past, your own history, you have encountered narcissists in your life. You ever been in a meeting where I was stunned when I found out Joseph Smith, Freudian slip, Donald Trump had his cabinet stand up in a meeting and go around the room and everybody express how grateful they were to be part of Donald Trump's administration. Because I've been in that meeting when the boss, I worked for a firm briefly in California where they called a meeting. They had even the people from the warehouse come into this meeting room, standing room only, and every person go around the room and tell the boss how grateful they were to have a job, and with tears in their eyes, as Donald Trump says. I got to stop confusing Donald Trump and Joseph Smith in the names. Donald Trump says, with tears in their eyes, people got up to explain how I couldn't get a house because my credit wasn't good enough. And so the company put $100,000 into my bank account so that I could qualify for a loan for my house. And then I had to give it back, but so I could qualify. I'm like, are we confessing to crimes? I mean, but every person had to go around the room and tell about how the boss who's sitting there at the front of the room, how their life was saved because they came to this company and started working here. And I said, and I remember at that point, I was already out of the church. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is the Joseph Smith moment. This is when you get up in front of everybody and you will tell them how certain you are that the Book of Mormon is the product of the gift of God. I love my brothers and sisters. I know I love my mom and dad. I know this church is true, and I know that Joseph Smith is a true prophet. I know that the Book of Mormon is true. This is the behavior of a malignant narcissist. Anyway, I've ranted on for a while now.
Well,
I'm happy if you still have time. I'm happy to talk about the existential crisis thing.
Oh, that's right. We haven't gotten to that yet. Well, I really, first of all, I have a large, faithful audience that watches my program. And I know that some of the stuff you said, or a lot of the stuff you said, is going to make them feel very uncomfortable. I remember I was talking to some people when we were doing the ethnogenic stuff with the, using the magic mushrooms theory, and stuff like that with the early church. And I remember talking to one of the people who had produced that movie. And he goes to me, says, aren't you afraid you're going to lose your faith in Jesus by but by this whole idea, like, well, maybe they were spiking the wine in the first century church and it was all mass hallucinations. He's like, aren't you afraid you're going to lose your faith? And I said, no. I said, because I already lost my faith once already. And so I don't have that fear of losing faith because I've already lost my faith. I
Hmm.
have regained a testimony, if you will, or regained faith. And so the things you say, you can make all the arguments against religion in general, that you're making about, the Mormon church. So it's not like, you're making specific arguments, but generally speaking, I could hop on the bandwagon and make the same arguments about just about any group, any religion. And so I think that's why it doesn't bother me. Now, for those of you who are believers and this bothers you, just ask yourself a question, how strong is your faith if arguments like this are bothering you? Is there doubt there? I don't know. And then why is it that, like, for instance, when I became an atheist, nobody would come to me that were faithful and say, "Hey, Steve, why'd you become an atheist?" They were never interested in hearing my story, but they had their own stories as to why they became an atheist, but they didn't
Mm.
want to hear it from me, but they would have their own views. Oh, it was sin, it was this, it was that. Well, he was always, you know, they would come up with these reasons why I became an atheist. And I'd be like, you can just ask me. But I knew that they were afraid to ask me because they were afraid they're going to become an atheist. That's really kind
Right.
of when it comes down to it. So I'm really sensitive to these types of conversations, but I think it's important that when people are leaving the evangelical church in droves, people are leaving the Latter-day Saint church. I mean, it's I know, like, they like to talk about, well, our rate of growth, we're still growing, but it's slowing down substantially. In the mid 80s, you guys are supposed to be a worldwide religion. You're going to be a world religion by the end of this century, and that's not happening. The numbers are not bearing it out. So we're seeing a slowing of growth in the Latter-day Saint church. We're seeing a lot of young people leaving both the churches. These are the arguments. These are the conversations that they're watching. They're learning about the Book of Mormon from Aaron Ra when he does his deconstruction of the Book of Mormon. I had Aaron Ra on to talk about that a couple of years ago. And
I saw
so I
that.
think it's important that we do that. So I guess, Joe, I mean, I do, I guess, if you could, can you give me, because I want to have you back. Actually, this was a fantastic conversation, but can you give me just maybe a Cliff Notes version of would you be able to do a Cliff Notes version of your existential crisis? Is that even possible?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
And
let's
I
do it.
I apologize that I've managed to avoid it so far.
No, that's fine.
The long short of it is that when I was 11 years old, 10 to 11 years old, so before even the Ted Bundy experience that I spent more time on than I probably would have liked to, uh, I tried to um, take my own quietus. I tried to uh, end this existential misery. Now, at the time, they didn't have any kind of diagnostic for what we now would call high functioning autism, what is now no longer called Asperger's syndrome, and for very good reason, if you know the story of Dr. Asperger. But I now have three children who are on the autism spectrum and see the experience that I had in them and see around the same age, 11, 12, 13 years old, how we got to the point where their therapists, they were in therapy, wouldn't, no therapy for this kid in 1991, 1992. Um, you know, their therapist tells us, so we're going to go ahead and put all the sharp things away in the house for a few days and keep, so and so or so and so, so and so, won't name them by name, away from them for about 24 to 48 hours and keep them in the same room with their parent or somebody and have a plan. And it's like, oh, and I can see this experience with them, that this is the same thing that I was experiencing. So I can plainly concede that what I went through at the young age that I did is not everybody's experience, and I get that. But it's an experience that I find more and more as I talk about it with people who are people of faith and people who are no longer people of faith, people who are atheists, have this long dark night of the soul. I had it from the time throughout my teenage years as a Mormon teenager, and I had to struggle against it by myself without medication, without therapy, because there was no such thing in the 1990s. I put to you, there really was no way. And it's in some ways quite a remarkable thing that I made it to be a 19-year-old who put in his papers to go on a mission. Then I went to Peru for 2 years, a believing Mormon kid, people described as a very spiritual or Peter priesthood person, you know, and full of fife and, you know, piss and vinegar, forgive my language. But, you know, I was out there ready to convert the world. I believed in it all. And then actually living in my depression while I was there and in the anxiety of, I'm not enjoying this. What does that tell me about what kind of Christian I am, what kind of follower of Christ I am, what kind of Mormon I am, what kind of person I am? Why am I not enjoying this? Why is it so hard? Why am I having all these doubts? And the more that I would preach to other people is the more I would doubt. And then one day, to put it plainly, I was arguing with a Catholic man in an argument very much similar to the one that Trent and Jacob had. And he asked me, and he said, why would you ask me to leave a church that has hundreds of years of tradition for my family? And I knew the answer to this per the Book of Mormon. I said, would you abandon Christ's call to you for the sake of family tradition, for a family tradition? And he said, wow. And he was a little taken aback. I could tell he was impressed with that. And I said, how did you find out about Mormonism? Okay. Okay. Yes, my parents are Mormon. My father's parents were Mormon. You know, I said, but we believe that every person is a convert, that in this church, every person comes to Christ on their own terms and their own belief, their own personal testimony. And he said, we believe that in Catholicism. Sure, sure, guy. Yeah, whatever. And he's like, no, I'm serious. We believe every person is confirmed at catechism and after catechism because they as a reasoning person came to the church in good faith. And he said, so here's what we'll do. I will have Catholic missionaries come to my home. You sit and take your little name tags off and you listen to their message and you sincerely in your heart of hearts consider that you were wrong about Mormonism and consider taking the catechism and becoming members of the Catholic Church, and I will take lessons from you. How about that? And with all my heart, Stephen, I wanted to say, yes, let's do it. Because in my heart of hearts, my belief that this life is meaningful was predicated on that. It was a reasonable thing for me to decide that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, that the Book of Mormon was true, and that the priesthood, more than anything else, was true, and that I was a recipient of the power of God that Joseph Smith had, that Joseph Smith was ordained to, and called to a specific mission in life. And I realized, but my mission president, the elders of the church, the apostles would say, no. I was not there to learn about their religion. I was there to preach the true religion and to get baptisms, to bring people into Christ through the saving ordinances of baptism and confirmation. And I went and I said, I can't do that. And he's like, you lost the debate, my friend. You lost it. Everything you just pretended to, you lost it. And I went home steaming mad because I knew he was right. I knew he was right. And at that moment, it all came crashing down. The Korihor moment came to me. I realized over the course, that was in my last area. After 2 years of preaching the gospel, the more I had preached it, the less I believed, and the more I wanted to end it all. And I realized if I spend any more time dwelling on this, it's going to end up with my going into the bathroom in the middle of the night, which is how I understood it then. Because on a mission, the only time you're not with your companion is when you were in the bathroom. Some missions, you couldn't even do that. But in my case, I could go to the bathroom by myself at least. And that's where I knew, I remember thinking, you never hear stories about missionaries who don't come home because they couldn't hack it in life once they were out on their mission. But I can't be the only one. I can't be the only one experiencing this. And it wasn't until I was an ex-Mormon that I realized how many people had the same story. that this existential crisis of asking yourself, if I am not a son of God and I don't have a purpose imbued in me from before my birth, then what is the reason why I would carry on with, given all of the pressure that I feel and all the reason I want my existential suffering to come to an end? And I look at and I didn't have an answer for that, but I was determined to find something, a natural argument that made more sense, that made my life make more sense. And it's been over 20 years I've been in pursuit of that answer. And I can tell you this, to your faithful audience, Stephen, and I'm sorry if this is not quite as Cliff Notes as you would like it to be. I can tell you this, I don't go to a better non-heaven when I die if I make atheists along the way. That's the difference between me and a missionary Elder Rawlins and ExmoJoe. I can't tell you, if my greatest fear, if you were to be discouraged from believing in God or believing in Mormonism or Christianity, on my words, would be that you would come to me and say, all right, Joe, you sold me. God is dead. There's no such thing. The Book of Mormon's not true. The Bible is BS. Joe, tell me, what is the key to believing that life is worthwhile? I can give you what works for me. But the fact of the matter is, if the Bible is working for you, if the Book of Mormon is working for you, I don't know that those aren't good bases for people to carry on going. And if you think to yourself, well, if the historicity of the Book of Mormon isn't true, then it isn't true. I would suggest you've fallen into a trap that you can seriously live without. I often ask myself this, what would it take for me to still be Mormon? And when I put it all together, I go, yeah, that would never fly. But there are some people out there, I think, as a matter of fact, I know, because ever since I left the church, Mormons tell me this all the time. Christians tell me this all the time. I know that about the Book of Mormon. I still believe because I need it in my life. There are Mormons who go to church who are sitting in the pews. I tell you right now, I say it again and again, you'll never find a bigger gathering of agnostics than in the pews of a church. There are people inside the Mormon church right now who believe that Joseph Smith was a pervert, a drunk, and a liar. And they still go to church because they believe in the church. There are people who believe that President Nelson, Russell M. Nelson, is a fallen prophet. I know them. I've met them. And they go to church. They go to general conference. They bow their head and pray. They go to the temple. They bow their head and say yes because they need it. And there are people who read the Book of Mormon. I agree with this guy, Jared Hickman. There are people who read the Book of Mormon, who open it up and believe that they can turn to a certain page and sola scriptura style, read a passage, and it was divinely inspired. It was meant to come to them in this moment, in this time. And yet probably don't believe that historically the historicity of Lehi and Nephi and the Jaredites and Jesus coming to the Americas and happening to teach pretty much exactly the same thing he teaches in the Gospels, they find that not as compelling. For them, the value is in being able to open the book, find the passage, and they feel inspired. And for those people, they make it work. It doesn't have to be objectively true. And this is the thing about meaning for me, that I reject Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Rollo May, if people out there, if you've ever read Man's Search for Meaning and it bothered you, because it did for me, I hated that book. I was glad I learned more about the Holocaust, but I hated the book itself. And logotherapy and the whole idea of it, threw that away. I said, no, thank you. I don't need objective meaning to carry on going, to carry on living. But I read this book, but I didn't know how do you carry on? Why am I carrying on without meaning in my life, without believing that there's an objective purpose to my life, a reason why I was sent here? And I discovered this book by Dr. Rollo May, which he wrote in answer to Man's Search for Meaning. And it was called Man's Search for Himself. And he argues in there that Freud and Jung and psychotherapy were supposed to teach us, and failed ultimately, to teach us that that the way to deal with our anxiety is to make the unseen seen, to get into the psyche and start revealing the things that you think that you don't realize you know about yourself. And when you do that with existential philosophy included in it, and you realize that meaning, it's not about what is meaningful objectively, which is to say, when you say something's objective, it means independent of the thought of conscious beings, of the perspective of conscious beings, right? You begin to realize that it is, as Hamlet says, that nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's as Siddhartha, the Buddhagupta, said in the principle, the first noble truth of Buddhism, which is called Dhaka in Sanskrit, is that all that is conscious is in suffering, is in pain. The way literally it means all that is born is in pain. But the way that people say, the way the more modern translation should be, to be conscious is to suffer. And I think that's true. I think that's exactly what they were getting at. And without knowing at least a dose of that philosophy, you're not going to get to understanding this, probably the most important truth I have learned since being an atheist, since being a human being alive in the world. If it matters to me, then it matters. Yes, I live in a nihilistic world, meaning that a world where I can see no way that there's a purpose to any of it. And if there weren't human beings or aliens or some of our smarter dolphins or orcas or elephants, some of these more conscious and aware animals observing us, and there would be nobody to say the humans were here and their life was meaningful, their life was purposeful. I don't think that it's possible that any such meaning outside of us exists. But at the end of the day, even our world doesn't exist when you think about it, except in our minds. Like I said before, the magic trick inside your mind, if you don't know how the illusion is done, how does your mind build the magic trick in your world, the only world you know? It's magic. Inside the world, it's magic. And so if inside your world, part of the magic is, I don't know how Joseph Smith did it, but he did it, and it's meaningful to me. If you died tomorrow believing that, what hell would you go to in the atheist world? None. Atheism is devoid of content. It won't tell you what's meaningful about life. It won't tell you what's not meaningful. It won't even tell you what's true or not true about religion. All atheism is that you don't believe that God exists. And at the end of the day, it's not a club. Any atheist will tell you that. We are not a club. We are people who are labeled as being in this club because we're not in other people's clubs. And they don't get it. They don't realize that it's a label. It's a way of excluding us from their club, not because we don't believe in their God, but because we believe in a set of values and principles. We just happen to be a group of people who have a reasonable sense, an epistemology based upon critical thinking. And for me, that's what was magnificent about the Korihor argument, is I looked at that and for one brief moment, in spite of my not wanting it to be true, my mind touched the mind of Joseph Smith and saw a man in crisis, not even a man, to be honest with you, a boy in crisis around the same age that I experienced mine, and saw, here's a man who is suffering, doesn't know who he is, doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing in his life. And this story came to him and he saw an opportunity, whether it was inspired by God, which of course I don't believe, whether it was inspired by God or whether it was his psyche's way of trying to heal the fracture of the world as he saw it, as he expected it to be, and the world as it actually was, as he observed it to be. This was his way through it. And for now 200 years going on, there have been millions of people who take that same thing and use it in their life and find meaning in it. The fact that it is not objectively true, that's based on things that are objective lies, is not really important at that time. It's the same thing with the Bible. the fact that the Bible is chock full of lies, if you ask me, you find it all over the place. I look at things like Exodus or Genesis and the fall from being cast out of the Garden of Eden. I'm looking at them like, okay, can we agree to this? This is scientifically debunked. This didn't happen. And I look at that and I say, what a short-sighted way to look at the inclusion of these stories in the Bible. If you look into how these stories came about, it's fascinating. Somebody sat down and said, let's tell the story about how we were driven from Egypt, about how we were led out of Egypt, excuse me, and into this world where we are the promised land, where we are the peculiar people. And let's tell this story to our children, and it will instill in them the values of what it means to be a Jew. And then anybody who looked at that and said, okay, well, we were a bunch of disparate Levantic tribes who are really not altogether and significantly different from these other Levantic tribes. And whoa, guy. You're talking about the world as it was. I'm talking about the story that will teach us and teach our children, teach their children how to be better, and why your life is important. It's important that you are here because you are God's chosen people. And if you try to muddy that up with what actually did or didn't happen, that's just going to ruin it. Give the story. And so I look at that and I say, do I believe that the Gospels are true? No, definitively. And the more I look into the story of it, the more convinced I am that if there was a Jesus of Nazareth, which I will put to you as plausible. As a matter of fact, it's very plausible that there was a Jewish itinerant preacher from Second Temple Judaism. Yes. I sure think it's fascinating to look at the possibility that there wasn't. But I have to say, it's definitely plausible that there was. And that somebody would look at, he overturned the money changers, the table of the money changers in Jerusalem, not in Samaria. Right. I say, what a great, I agree, 100%.
Yep.
Look at Jesus suffering in Gethsemane. Where is Golgotha? Point to Golgotha. Point to Calvary on a map for me. And I'll call BS. I'm warning you. If an atheist tells you that, I'm going to say BS. Not true. Not true. But what does Calvary mean? What does Golgotha mean? It means the place of the skull. It's like, that's important. The fact that it doesn't exist in Jerusalem, maybe it does. The fact that it doesn't exist anywhere that you could see on a map in Jerusalem is not as important as what it means to the person who reads it and says, what is God trying to tell me? What is the inspiration of this trying to tell me? If you see the story of Christianity or Mormonism, I'm trying to wrap this up for you because I know you don't want to spend your whole Labor Day with me doing this.
Yes, we're doing this on Labor Day, folks. Yes.
In the distant past. Or are we? What proof do you have that we did this on Labor Day? Is to look at it and say, stop looking for the objectivity. If you, the believer, want my unbeliever's opinion, any of you out there, don't look for objectivity in your truth. Find your truth and find in it that if it makes sense inside the world, that in your mind, and it quiets your fears and your anxieties, and it gives you a better chance of living the life that makes you feel like it's worthwhile from here until that future. So you think about this for a second. You get your head around this for a minute. Your death is in the future, in the path. In the path that you're on. They say that a man's destiny is what he finds on the path he takes to avoid it. You can eat healthy, you can exercise, you can take medication, you can do try to be healthy so you can live as long as you want. But if you die in a car accident, it's happening. If a plane falls from the sky and lands on your house, it's happening. So your death is out there, a fixed point in the future. And between here and there, every breath you take, try not to panic, you folks at home. Every breath you take, every moment you pass, you're getting closer to it. It's getting closer. It's getting closer. It's getting closer. Every moment you take from here until there, the best that any atheist can say, you can spend that in pain from things in your past that you can't change, or you can spend it in pain worrying about possibilities in the future, most of which are not going to happen. You can, as the Stoics say, try to mitigate, take the most likely things and try to mitigate your risks, mitigate your risk, mitigate your risk. Or you can, I think, as Schopenhauer encourages us, and the Buddha encourages us, realize the Buddha said that the Dhaka was that all men suffer, all that is born suffers. But the second noble truth of Buddhism is karma, that what brings you suffering is your attachment to the material world, is your, and I would say, I'd go even further and say, yes, attachment even to objectivity. You're living your life on the ocean, on the sea. Your body has to adjust its weight. You have to find your sea legs. And if you reach out to the deadness, to the pier that says, it has to be objectively true that Jesus was a man who rose from the dead on the, after on the third day, after 3 days, however you want to call it, and you hold on to it, you're gonna, and then say, why does my arm hurt? 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 It's because you've got Schopenhauer and the Buddha and Jesus and all of these other great wise men from history ish looking at you going, let me let go of the pier, let go of this material need to believe that your meaning is objective, because that's just making you suffer more. Let it go and see that you'll find your sea legs and you will live a better life. Will you be in pain? Yes, you will be in pain. You will suffer, but you can manage it better when you stop trying to apologize. Stop making the apologist argument for that it has to be objectively true. And that's my advice to anybody.
Yeah, thanks for
And
sharing
then
that. And this was an important conversation that we had today. I do feel really strongly that a lot of what you have to say would resonate with people. I also have to say, when I deal with a lot of these apologists who attack me, there's always a fear there. There's fear. It's always motivated by fear.
Mhm.
And it's very weird. But then I realized, it's because part of them is afraid to concede anything, because once they concede something, the whole thing unravels. And so that to me is like, explains to me their unwillingness to engage with me because of their fear of dealing with somebody who says, "Oh, I'm not afraid of losing my faith because I already lost it."
Mm.
They don't want to even talk to somebody like me because it doesn't work in their own little boxes that they want to put you in. And I think to me, it's like, no, I'm taking hand grenades and blowing all those boxes up. And because I want people to have genuine conversations, because I believe that we all are image bearers, and we're all afforded the dignity of bringing each person's faith and values and ethical systems or whatever to the table to have adult conversations. I just think that the old ways we need to move away from and start engaging the fact that we are on this rock, hurtling through space, and we don't know. We just don't know. We can't. And anybody says they do know, that's a defense mechanism. That's their way of coping. I don't know. I'm an agnostic Christian in many ways, and I don't know Christian. I believe in Jesus, that he died for me on the cross, and I will have eternal life. But I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking of eternity. I want to spend more time talking about here and now, where we're at, and the lives that we can affect in this world. And just, if anything, and one of the things that drives me crazy is that, a lot of these apologists are Calvinists, and they think it's a good thing that the vast majority of God's image bearers are going to be suffering and languishing in hell for eternity. This is good. This is the good news. I on the other hand say that's a horrible way of looking at it. That's not a good thing. And if there's people suffering in hell, wailing and gnashing of teeth, then I'm certainly not in heaven. So I think we also have to look at it from that perspective as well, and quit using scriptures to hit people over the head and to hurt them and do them harm, but to realize that the scriptures are a beautiful thing. And I think that there's wisdom in these documents, whether it's the Bible or the Book of Mormon, and look at it from that. There were real people who wrote these things down, We have no doubt Joseph Smith wrote this stuff down. Whether he was inspired or not is that's that's secondary to this. This is a remarkable document. It's an audacious document, and that's what I love about it. That's what I love about the Bible. That's what I love about the people who are willing to put themselves out there and be a prophet.
Mhm.
To speak to the time and place that they're in, and tell people, a lot of the stuff you've been taught ain't true, and it's time to wake up.
Mhm.
Either way, my friend, I think that you're an awesome human being. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought today. I'm going to have you back on. This was great. I'm going to
I hope
include
so.
I'm going to include you on. We're going to have panel discussions. I want to get back to, I used to do a lot more panel discussions. I think you'd be a great panelist. I'd love to get you and Josh on a panel. Oh my gosh, wouldn't that be fun?
Mhm.
But and again, folks, let's see. Maybe Joe would be the atheist that can debate Jacob. I don't know. Maybe I could be the evangelical that can debate Jacob about the Book of Mormon. Love that. I think it would be, but again, I'm not in it to win it. I'm in it to have a good conversation. And I think today was a good conversation. What do you think, Joe?
I think so. And I will say to your audience, because I do know that most of your audience is probably believers. It makes sense to me that they are of various kinds. And I will say this, you've been such a gracious host, Stephen. And I got to be honest with you, of all the people I've ever talked to on these subjects, you're probably the most intelligent and well-read I have encountered, and uh, the least disingenuous, the most integral one that I have talked to. And I thank you for that. And I will say to your audience also, I hope that I haven't offended anybody. I am an atheist, which means I could be a jerk. And I get that. I own that. I kind of love that. But amidst all the so-called hitch slapping that I like to do, I do believe that more will come from us being able to have that fruitful, productive conversation in between believers and unbelievers, and that you will at least come away saying that guy said a lot of things I don't like and a lot of things I don't agree with, and he smiles at the wrong times, and he behaves the wrong way, and a lot of him really kind of weirds me out why he's fascinated about some guy Ted Bundy, but or whatever, and say, but I will say this: he was polite, and he was snarky, but he made me think about things, and I don't feel like he judged me as being a bad person for believing. And if that's not the case, allow me to state it once and for all. If this is working for you, keep it going. Just as an atheist, I say, if you're being a good person and this is helping you to resolve your existential anxiety, go forth with it. And if anything I told you made you doubt, then to he double hockey sticks with me. Forget me. I don't listen to me. Go forward in what's making sense to you and what's working. That's what I said.
All right. Well, this is great. Thank you so much for joining us, folks. Looking forward to the comments. I would love to, hopefully this will be a good conversation starter in the various forums that we operate in. I would love to hear from you, whether it's on Facebook or on Reddit, here on the comment section in YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and all the other places. We want to hear from you what your thoughts are on these really important conversations that we're having. Again, these are important conversations. We need to have more of these rather than doing all these debates where we're fighting each other. Let's have I think a healthy, helpful conversation, an adult conversations, which we had today. If I wanted to make this a debate today, I could have, but I'm not interested in doing that. That we would just be arguing for 2 hours, and that's not fun either. And I just enjoyed this, so I would like to hear your thoughts and everything like that. There will be links in the description to Jared's channel. Also, for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel, MormonBookReviews.com and Patreon and PayPal and Venmo. Please, we can't do this without you with your financial support, and we do greatly appreciate you. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.